Hi everyone, I'm Luke Hector and this is The Broken Meeple, a show where I devote my time to ranting and raving about board games, but usually more the latter part. We'll get on with the review in just a moment, but first I just need to say a quick word from the sponsor.
As gamers, we find it hard to deal with empty shelves, some worse than others. You therefore want a supplier that has what you need at affordable prices and delivers on time. For me, that supplier is KIENDA. They offer a discount on bulk purchases as well as a point scheme for future acquisitions down the line. If there's a hot title you're after, chances are KIENDA's got it. Wingspan? Mine. Arc Nova? Mine. Eclipse? Actually I hate that game, it's terrible, but you might like it. If you use the referral link in the description below and sign up for a new account, you'll get 5% discount on your first order over £60. So let's make gaps in your collection a thing of the past. Get down to KIENDA and start saving today. Thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of the video.
Get on with it.
Yeah, you didn't think I was going to let this one escape from me, did you? No, thanks to a fellow viewer who is a Stonemaier champion, I'm able to actually get a copy of this before it officially releases in the UK and give my full thoughts on it. Yes, this isn't a speed review, we're doing a full whammy for this. So to put some context behind this, this is effectively a Wingspan spin-off. So we've already done this before. You can check out my last year review for Wyrmspan, where I gave that one a 7, I think it's more closer to a 6 by now, and I like it, but I had some problems with it. It felt like Wingspan with too many extra steps and a worse theme, but that's debatable. But the idea with this is that this is meant to be a lighter Wingspan. So it's changed it from birds to fish, still keeping the whole realistic approach, but this is meant to be a lighter version of the game, easier to get into, less rules, less complexity. So, that all falls to be seen. But what do I think of Wingspan in general? It's one of my favourite games ever. I love Wingspan. And my Wingspan copy is absent, because it normally is on the shelf. I think I took it to the club last night, but it's got all the expansions in it. So it has got Europe, it's got Oceania, and it's got Asia in it. I don't like every aspect of the expansions. I mean, flock mode can die in hell. I don't really care about the extra 1 to 2 player mode that they put in Asia because I tend to play it with groups mainly. And, Oceania is kind of a must-have in my opinion because I think you really want those revised player boards that allow you to balance the three different powers that you have, like food, eggs, and cards, but also because it introduces the nectar resource, which allows you to play more big birds, so you end up playing more cards. I've got it fully complete, and I love it. It is one of my favorite games. It is 10 out of 10 territory, so this already is kind of fighting an uphill struggle here. But I don't expect this to replace Wingspan, just as I didn't expect Wyrmspan to replace Wingspan. The idea is can you have both? Can they exist in their own right, or, is it better to just go back to the original Wingspan? So I'm going to look at this in detail, pros and cons, give my thoughts on the game in general, but also I can't really review it in a vacuum. I've got to compare it to Wingspan. I mean, hell, it says a Wingspan game, and the title is still dumb as bricks. This whole Finspan thing. Yeah, you remember the memes that were sent out for this thing? It was kind of ridiculous. But I have to just make that context very clear before I dive in. So, is this worth all the incredible hype that this got? Or are we just basically repeating Wyrmspan where it's kind of, it exists but is unnecessary?
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
So if you've played Wingspan, you've already played 90% of this game, but allow me to explain nonetheless. In this game, you are basically building up a tableau of fish cards on your board, which consists of 3 separate columns for the 3 main sort of diving actions that you've got. The cards themselves come in all sorts of different unique shapes and sizes, where they all follow the same iconography, in which case they tell you the cost, where they can go, what size they are, what victory points they are, what on-play bonuses they give you, or what game end or abilities they give you. But the main thing is that they are all different unique types of fish. We're talking everything from the tiny little, let's see, find a nice small one here, the tiny little pygmy seahorse, to a short-spined spur dog, and I'm pretty sure there's a big Atlantic shark in here somewhere. We're talking small to big fish of all kinds. On your turn, you play 6 turns in a round, and you have 4 rounds, effectively 4 weeks as they call it. In each turn, you have a choice. Play a fish card, or do one of the 3 diving actions. Playing a card literally just means paying the cost in the top left of the card, and playing it. Oh, there we go. And typically this usually involves you spending cards, or egg tokens, or possibly even little fish tokens. Whatever is necessary. Some of these cards consume other fish, which simply means to overlap. More on that a little bit later in the video. But the idea with this is that after you've placed some of these cards down, your alternative action can be to place a diver on the top of one of the columns and work your way down, triggering all cards that come in between the top and the bottom of the board, much like in Wingspan when you went from left to right. But there are a few little differences. Firstly, you can play the cards here wherever you like, really. I mean, yes, you are restricted to what the card tells you. It might tell you it has to be in a particular, like, sunny zone or the Twilight Zone. It might even tell you it has to be in a specific column. But the idea is that I don't need to fill the board up top to bottom. I can fill it up in whatever order I like. And so once I've got a few cards out here, let's see, a few nice cute little fishy. The idea is that when you activate the column, you move down, and once you get to a particular card, you trigger any when activated bonuses on it. So they appear in brown boxes. For example, this, what's it called? A skipjack tuna allows you to hatch an egg with all players. So some of these are interactive, but not too many of them. You work your way down to the very bottom of the board, but at the very bottom, there is a little extra bonus you have for your first diver that goes down there. In addition to that, the zones are broken up into, as I said, sunny, I forget what they're called, but 3 different zones. And the idea is that if you have a fish in that zone when you dive down, you'll get a zone bonus, which is typically cards for the left one, making eggs for the middle one, and hatching eggs for the right one. But what exactly are you doing with these eggs and little fish? Well, the main thing is that once you've got an egg on the different fish, they can hatch into little cute little fishies. And the idea is that with a particular symbol in the game, you can move these fish, and if you get 3 of them on the same space, they turn into a school of fish. This doubles their points value, and they can't be broken up. It's basically another way to score points. At the end of each week, you have a scoring tile that dictates where everybody gets a prize, but whoever has the most gets an additional point bonus. If you flip over to side B, you have these random ones that you can pick for the game, but side A is basically pre-printed for you. But it's not a first, second, third, fourth, it's literally who got the most, they get a bonus. Otherwise, get what you achieved. Simple as that. Once you get to the end of week 4, you activate any game end abilities on your fish, and then you score the victory points, which is essentially 6 points for schools of fish, 1 point for various little fish tokens and eggs and consumed fish underneath, and also the victory point value of your fish in general. Whoever has the most is, of course, the winner.
Of course!
Not a lot to learn, is there? At least from an overview standpoint. It's definitely a simple game to learn, though, but there is a good and a bad side to this. We'll touch on the bad side to this later on, but for the good part, these aren't the most complicated rules for somebody who is a gamer or somebody who has had experience with Wingspan. The rulebook is not particularly thick. There's iconography guides on the back and supplemented for each player, which is nice. It tells you the anatomy of a card and what all the icons in the game are. Pretty handy, and I respect the fact that they do this for each player. I keep banging on about this. But the rules are not particularly plentiful. I mean, there's a reasonable amount of text. I might have liked a few more pictorial examples, but there isn't a huge amount to learn in here, and it's a simple game. If you've played Wingspan, you can pretty much skim over the rulebook, and you'll get 90% of it down. You just might miss 1 or 2 very little niche rules now and again. But yeah, when I was learning this, it really didn't take that long. And if you really want to go the next mile, if you've got the Dized app, D-I-Z-E-D, there's even a tutorial for the game on that. So you've got multiple ways to learn the game if you really want. These are still pretty nice. I mean, they're all very different fish. I know very little about fish. I know less about fish than I do about birds. All I know is that I like to eat fish, and on the Mediterranean diet, it's kind of required. But, in general, I mean, all of these ones here, white spotted puffer, a pennant coral fish, a Mediterranean damsel fish, they've all got such weird, crazy names. Smooth Oreo Dory. So half of it is from Finding Nemo, and half of it is a chocolate biscuit confection. It's like, wow, how does that work? But, all of these fish cards are nice to look at, and everything is clean. The graphic design is generally clean. Some people will trip up over a couple of the symbols on here, but you have got the guide to read if necessary, and you want to understand the little nuances with each. But, nothing feels cluttered or crowded. The only slight negative is that you are squeezing quite a bit of information on these cards, so, certainly, you've got a lot on here. I mean, you've got the title, symbols, you've got the when played, you've got the special bonuses, you've got the flavor text, you've got the fin size, which is relevant, victory points, what zone it can go in, what cost it has, all of this is squeezed onto a horizontal card, and it can be a little bit like, oh Christ, especially when you've got to look at like 5 of these in front of you. Maybe there's just a few too many there, but it's not a big deal. For anybody familiar to the Wingspan games, you're not really going to struggle with this. We'll get on to the negative side if you're not a Wingspan player, though, a little bit later.
Oh, short answer yes with an F, long answer no with a but.
If you're going into this expecting it to be a shorter game than Wingspan, then it kind of is shorter, but not by a lot. Probably by the same length as one of these Fishy's Thins, to be honest. It says 45 to 60 minutes on the box, and it will keep to sort of that. You are probably looking at 60 minutes to 90 minutes though when you're playing this with 4 to 5 players, much the same as Wingspan. If you're only playing this solo with 2 to 3 players, you can zoom through this game pretty quickly and it will beat out Wingspan in that regard. Just don't expect for it to be like a 30-minute filler, it just simply won't be.
40 seconds? But I want to know!
The game also comes with a solo mode, and it's a pretty straightforward solo mode all round, really. I mean, it basically stems down to flipping a card, and depending whether it's a dive action or play a fish action, you do what's required, and the iconography is pretty straightforward. I mean, the rulebook here is simpler than the other one. There's not a lot of pages at all, and you've got multiple ways to adjust the difficulty. You've even got a variant in the game that allows you to basically sort of turn on what's called Ravel mode. I think it's called Ravel, and it forces you to be a bit more selective as to where you place your fish cards, because doing so at the wrong time could give the Autumner a lot of points. And it's a good thing that this is not a, like, you know, try and rank yourself game. This is beat the Autumner. The Autumner doesn't have a playmat. They just gain tokens and fish cards and spend them as necessary as per the cards. They score points at the end of the game on certain criteria, and you can adjust the difficulty to make them score a little more for certain things, but you've got to beat the Autumner. That's basically it. So it's good that this is not just beat your own score, because that would be a little bit boring. I approve that this is an Autumner that is very easy to pilot, very easy to use, and doesn't take up a lot of your time. In fact, you will actually end up at that 45-minute mark on the box easily if you're playing this solo. It is nice and super quick.
This is why Superman works alone.
Now, in the good section, I talked about how simple the game was to learn. However, that is from the perspective of someone who's played a lot of games before or has played Wingspan and fully understands how that works. If you're in that situation, you'll blend over quite nicely. But what this game isn't, and I'm kind of disappointed that it's not, is that this is not gateway level Wingspan. It is lighter than Wingspan, but if you imagine that wyrmspan is essentially Wingspan with extra steps, this is essentially Wingspan with less steps. And it's not that much simpler than Wingspan. You know, wyrmspan is not that much more complex than Wingspan. There's just more fiddly steps you have to jump through, you know, more hoops you have to jump through to achieve all of what you need to achieve. But the rules aren't that much more complex in it. Well, here, same kind of deal. You have less hoops to jump through for certain things, but the game is not that simple for someone who's not played games before, who has not come across these Wingspan games before. Yes, I'd probably advise you teach this one to a brand new gamer before Wingspan, but honestly, there's not a huge amount of difference. The difference in complexity between the two is not as big a gap as it should have been. If this could have been gateway level Wingspan, that would have been fantastic. It would have put it in the, you know, a good bit of the market. It could have been something you could have introduced to brand new gamers without any worry at all. But one thing that gateway games do not do well is when you have cards with unique abilities and icons. This sort of thing just throws off brand new gamers. And I know this because I have played this with multiple groups, and the same thing happens. Those familiar with Wingspan pick this up like no trouble. Those unfamiliar with Wingspan but familiar with games take a little longer, but they get the hang of it relatively quickly. But there's usually at least one person there who's never played any of the Wingspan games, is not that much of a gamer, and they're struggling. They don't know necessarily what to do with the board, you know, what their main tactics should be, and they have to spend quite a while going through the different cards trying to ascertain what's good and what's not. It can drag the game out on that respect. I mean, I tell you, if you play this with 4 or 5, you are looking at that, you know, 75 to 90 minute range for a game, and that's basically comparable to Wingspan at the same level. I mean, Wingspan will probably be a little bit longer, but yeah, for a game that's meant to be lighter than Wingspan, you'd expect this to be done within 60 minutes without any, like, rhyme or reason, you know, no excuses. It should be done within 60 minutes, and sometimes it really isn't. But, you know, I wanted this to be gateway level. I wanted you to be able to teach this game to just about anybody. I tried teaching Wingspan to my parents, and they're in their 70s, and they struggled to get it. You know, they struggled to get Wingspan. Fair enough. I wouldn't be able to teach this to them either. I don't think this is simple enough to. We're not talking the simplicity levels of something like Cascadia, you know, one of the best gateway games out there. This is just a little bit lighter than Wingspan, and it needed to be more than just a little bit lighter to stand out.
What is it like in your funny little brains? It must be so boring.
Now the rest of this section is going to concentrate more on the changes from wingspan to finspan, and it's in the bad section because for the most part they are worse than what they were before, or they don't work quite as well as I hoped they would. Firstly, let's talk about the changes to the interaction level. Now, Wingspan was never that much of an interactive game in the first place. You know, you had a few powers that keyed off other players, you know, once between rounds, but you kind of did your own thing, but somebody might nick the card that you were after. Expansions improved on this, but still not to a great extent. You know, European was a particularly good one for that, but at the end of the day, you have some powers that influence, you know, that influence multiple players, and people could take your dice out of the feeder and such. Well, here, this game is pretty much devoid of all interaction, bar a tiny little single caviar fish egg worth of interaction. And I do mean tiny. This thing has basically a few cards, and we're talking a small percentage of that deck that have all players, if activated, do this or something. And they're not even usually that major powers at the time, but yeah, there's not that many fish that affect all players. Most of the time they will affect just you. And that is it. There's no other interaction in this game. There is no face-up tableau of cards. You don't have food from a communal pool that you have to feed your fish with. You know, your hand is your own. Your board is your own. Nobody can manipulate anything. So the whole concept of this being up to 5 players...
Well, that was pointless.
If you play this solo, you're basically playing a simplified 2-player game, which again, might as well just play it solo. But every time you add a player on, all you do is add downtime and more time to the game. That's it. There's no other reason to add more players. Why would you play this with 5? It's just entirely not necessary.
5 is right out.
And woe betide you if you try to fit that many boards on this table. This vertical board is actually more problem than it's worth. You know, the photo you're about to see now, this is not the biggest table in the world, I will grant you, but this is that game cafe, okay? This is the table designed to have small games on for 4 players, or be ideal for 2 players head to head, right? I'm barely able to fit this game on that table. Yes, it will fit on my massive gaming table fine, but this is meant to be housing things like Lacerdas, not struggling with something like Finspan. And mainly it's just because of the shape of everything is weird, because you've got to have like one board in front of you for yours, and then you've got another board jutting practically in your face on the other player, and then another board to the right of you or whatever going out in that direction. So it's kind of like this weird zigzag thing of boards, but then that doesn't lend well to where you've got to put the card display, because that's got to be at least miles away from 2 players and really close to 2 others. But then you've also got this achievement board you've got to fit somewhere, and I honestly do not get why this is in the game, but they actually state in the rulebook your hand size, or your hand, is public information. So you've got to have room for anywhere between 0 to 10 cards at a time you could end up with, it has happened, in front of you. Good luck finding the space for that. But also, what is the friggin' point? Why? This is meant to be a game that's meant to be simpler than Wingspan. It's meant to be introducing people to the whole Span series. Why would those people be looking at other players' cards? I can't influence what you have. I can't deny you those cards you have. So what does it matter if they're public information? It doesn't make any sense!
It's stupid! It's stupid!
Such a dumb idea, and I don't get why nobody pointed that out in the playtesting side, or in the proofreading. But okay, you've got your hand of cards. Fair enough, you've got this. One thing I do like is that they do give you a personal discard pile. So if you discard cards as part of the cost, they go into a personal discard, and some effects in the game allow you to look for your discard pile and get one back. That is a decent effect. I do approve of this one. Although, you're trying to make this easier for players to get to grips with, adding more choices like that does not make this beginner player friendly. I mean, you're telling them that by the end of the, by like halfway through the game, they've discarded Lord knows how many cards, and now every time they get to look through their discard pile, they get to look through this smorgasbord of cards, trying to find one that is perfect for their situation. Yes, some people could take their turn while you're doing this, and I do recommend you do it that way, but again, it's forcing a beginner player to look at a ton of information that's just going to overwhelm them. They won't know which one to pick. You might as well just say draw the top card of your discard pile and make it simpler. But it's, some of these things kind of detract from what I think the game was aiming to do.
It's stupid! It's stupid!
So now consuming fish. Consuming fish is basically tucked cards. Every card underneath a fish is worth 1 point. So in order to consume a fish, it's essentially a case that you've got a fish, whether it's pre-printed or other, and the fish will go on top, and the one below it is effectively out of the game, but it's worth a point. There is only one time you really need to do that though, and that is when the fish card requires you to consume a fish. You know, some of the larger ones specifically have an egg cost consume a fish. Right, put it on top of a fish, it's a predator fish, it makes sense. The one below is worth a point, so you probably want to stick it on top of a fish that's only worth 1 point, because then you lose a point, but then gain a point, so it's not much of a difference. There's no incentive though to do that at any other time, because you've got all the spaces in the world, you're not restricted as to where you know, how far down the columns you can go other than what's on the card, so why not just play your fish in the spaces that you have? You might as well fill up your entire board before you consume any fish. There's no reason to. There's no penalty for having your spaces filled. There's no blockage or anything like that. So what does it really matter? It just feels like an arbitrary mechanic that's thrown into the game, but it only applies as the cost of certain cards. And the fact that they reward you points for it just, I don't know, is that just a balancing tool? But for a mechanic that's essentially like what tucked cards used to be. Tucked cards was actually a valid strategy in Wingspan. Here it's just an arbitrary thing that's bolted onto a cost mechanic in order to justify why you might play those fish.
Well, you got me. By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
You've got the achievement board for side A and side B. Side A is good if you just want to teach the game, and side B at least allows you a little bit of variety with these tokens, but there's not a lot of variation in the scoring tiles you have. I mean, most of them are basically to do with young fish or schools. They're to do with the size of the fin size, so small, medium or large fish, and how many eggs you might have. And occasionally there's a couple for tags and, you know, little abilities. So there's some here, but they're not like crazy amounts in terms of variety, but it is good that on side B you can at least have a little bit of variety in how they score. But ignore these at your peril, because honestly, this is kind of your bulk of your points. You know, they come from two sources: the cards that you place down and the achievements. And some of these achievements can be bonkers powerful. For example, in one game we played the other day, we had the large fish on week 1, 2 points per large fish. It is not easy to play large fish in your tableau. So people are barely getting 4 points by the end of week 1 for that. Then the second week was 3 points for young fish. It's definitely in there somewhere, I definitely had it. Yeah, 3 points for every young fish you have. That's bonkers. Because in the second round, basically nobody bothered to make schools of fish, and you're just littering yourself with a ton of these little fish tokens, and we're scoring something like 30 points plus for this bit, for this one objective compared to 4 in the previous one.
Super easy, barely an inconvenience.
But despite those other negatives I've said, which at the end of the day, each one is kind of a small negative that add up. They're not like individually major negatives. The main thing I got from this game is kind of like a sense of mediocrity. It doesn't feel as impactful or as fun as original Wingspan does. You know, when you play Wingspan, you've got a lot of these different abilities on those cards, and you can go for like the predator birds, you can go for the tuck cards, you can go for loads of eggs, you can do you know, card drawing strategies, you can do like heavy food strategies and stuff, and there's, you know, the expansions help even more. Now granted, the expansions are a separate thing. You know, we need to kind of compare also not just Wingspan with expansions to this, but also Wingspan Basic to this. But even the basic game of Wingspan gives you a little bit more variety in what you can do compared to this one. This one pretty much pigeonholes you into doing, you know, other than the massive achievement tiles now and again, what you do on your board is basically draw a bunch of cards, play some fish, lay some eggs, hatch them, and move these things into the same zone to make schools of fish. That's pretty much what you do for the entire game, and that gets a little repetitive even when you've effectively only got, what, 6, 12, 18, 24 actions in the game. You still feel a lot of the times like, you know, by the end of each round I've done 4 things, and then the last 2 are like, well, I guess I'll draw more cards then. I've already done it 3 times already, fine. It's like, I might as well just lay these eggs and probably spam them as well, because that's all good. You know, it doesn't feel as interesting as what Wingspan did. And that's not to say it's bad or anything like that, but by the time I'm 3/4 of the way through the game, particularly if it's a game that's dragging out a little bit too long, like you've got 4 or 5 players in there, I feel very much on the rinse repeat. Like the individual fish cards do not get me excited. I'm more interested in reading their flavor text and like commenting on their ridiculous names and their visuals than I am about what abilities they do or what, you know, what victory points they're worth or what their cost is. There just seems to be, you know, the idea that this is Wingspan with less steps, I think hurts this, because if you really enjoy Wingspan, I don't think you're going to get as much enjoyment out of this.
Well, that's a lot less fun.
So this verdict, this will probably make a few enemies by the end of this, but hear me out here. Wingspan is, shall we just accept, the daddy of the three, okay? Wyrmspan is Wingspan with too many extra steps and fiddly hoops to jump through. It's still a decent game. I like it fine, but it doesn't have the same elegance or, you know, interesting theme as Wingspan does. This one, on its own merit, you know, has some good aspects to it and is still a light, simple game that still gives you a decent amount of fun. But compared to what they did in Wingspan, Wingspan is still the daddy of the three, even if you don't factor in the expansions. I think Wingspan is still the daddy of the three, but if you do factor in the expansions, then Wingspan kicks these two to the curb, you know, pretty much instantly. So what is it about Finspan that holds it back? Well, I like its theme. Fish is cool. You know, I prefer birds, but fish is cool. I like the fact that it's about real life fish and you actually get to learn something from this. It is still very aesthetically pleasing. It's not as good as Wingspan, but Wingspan's kind of top tier on that level. This is still a nice, good looking game with a very nice colourful board and well produced cards and, you know, like, enough that what you need. It's also a simple game to learn, particularly if you've played Wingspan before. But it's not simple enough to be a gateway game or to be new gamer friendly. I think new gamers will struggle to deal with a lot of the abilities on these cards and like the different mechanics that you're doing, that it takes it certainly out of gateway level and just makes it just a little bit lighter than Wingspan. But this game really needed to be a lot lighter than Wingspan. It removes all the interaction in the game, yet introduces weird mechanics about having your hands public to everybody, which has no relevance in the game whatsoever. It's meant to be easier for players to learn, but then it introduces the personal discard pile, which as a gamer, I think is a cool mechanic. I think that is a great mechanic, but then it just makes it harder for new gamers to learn. So the game doesn't really achieve the, you know, the podium spot for a new gamer friendly version of Wingspan. I think I would still probably just teach the normal Wingspan, you know, to be honest. You know, maybe this Finspan if I felt like it. And with all said and done, regardless of whether you agree with some of the mechanical changes that they've done, this game is basically just Wingspan with less steps on it, and those steps being removed or tweaked make this not as enjoyable. You know, it's still fine. It's still like, oh yeah, I can play this and I can get some enjoyment out of it, but it's difficult to look at this in a vacuum. If you do look at this in a vacuum, then it's a decent, you know, it sort of maybe goes up a point. But when you've got to consider all three of them together, this one feels like a spin-off that A, didn't really need to exist, and B, doesn't really satisfy the criteria of what I wanted a lighter spin-off to do. This, you know, it just feels like an alternate to Wingspan. It's not a Wingspan 2.0. It's not even what I would call my first Wingspan. It's not light enough or simple enough to be that. And when you go through these mechanics of, you know, playing the fish cards and moving the little fish tokens around and getting schools, it gets a little repetitive and doesn't feel as interesting. You don't feel like you've got mega turns like compared to what Wingspan does. It feels like you're just doing a little bit at a time, little bit at a time, little bit at a time, but you never feel like you reach the big leagues or anything like that. So it's a decent game and it has some merits. A nice easy solo mode as well. But I think the rating for this has to be based on two factors. If you are basing this on a game that's got to fit in the league of the three Wingspan games, if Wyrmspan is a 6 or 7 at best, and, you know, Wingspan for me is a 9, 10 out of 10, this one I think overall, I don't know, 5 sounds a bit harsh as an average game. No, I think 5 is average. I think rather than do two ratings, let's try and conglomerate them together and try and think of this as its own game. I'm giving this one a 6 out of 10. It's a 6 out of 10 above average. I was tempted to give it a 5 though, and certainly if I'm comparing this to Wingspan, it might as well be a 5. You know, it's fine and I enjoy it, but I've got no interest in keeping this. I've got far better games that I can teach to new gamers, and if somebody wants to learn the Wingspan type of games, I'm going to get out Wingspan. I'll just show that because it honestly isn't that much more complex than this one. You've got cards with unique abilities. Yes, the Wingspan ones are a little bit more interesting, but they're not rocket science compared to the ones in here. But, you know, having a strict side of left to right, having specifically the food that works, you know, is a little bit easier to deal with than, you know, the movement around of eggs, you know, movement around of fish on these boards and the schools of fish, which the rules for that were a little bit weird. Like, why bother to move schools of fish around most of the time? It trips over itself with the tweaks that they've done, and this feels more like it's not really a cash grab, but it just feels like it's like taking the easy route by utilizing what is already successful, but not really creating something that stands out enough in its own right to be one that I would say, yeah, everybody should grab this one, or this will go on my shelf alongside Wingspan. This ain't gonna sit in the collection any longer. I think I might donate it to the cafe or let somebody else have it because I've got Wingspan. Why would I need this?
There's always a bigger fish.
So that's it for me on this episode of The Broken Meeple. If you like what you see, then please thumb it up on YouTube and thumb it up on Board Game Geek when it goes live on the page. Let me know your thoughts down below. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of divisive opinions about this, about Finspan being the best of the three, or my rating being too low. Some people are giving it 9 out of 10s, whether they can teach it to new gamers, fine. Hey, I'm going from experiences here. I play with a lot of people, both veteran heavy Lacerda gamers and new gamers, and I'm just talking from experiences that, you know, this is the way it's gone down. So, you know, I'm sure there's going to be different people that have their thoughts on this, and by all means, get them in the comments. Let's hear it, let's discuss, but let's be civil about it. Obviously, check out the Patreon if you want to help support the channel financially, but of course, bear your own finances in mind. But this channel runs as, you know, as a hobby, so it needs to be funded, and I thank the patrons who have supported me down to this day. So take care, and remember, regardless of whether your preference is fish or birds, it's still only a game. But seriously, Stonemaier, can we cut this out now and try something new? Take care.